Doomsday, Defiance, Defeating Disaster Through Verity of Verse. Of course, I use the word doomsday metaphorically. And as you can make out from the slides, I'm going to confine myself only to one disaster, and that is the Twin Tower terrorist attack of 9/11. It is not you who will speak, let the disaster speak in you. Earlier, when we talked of disasters, we mostly talked of natural disasters. But with unprecedented material progress, technological progress, and also a steep decline in priorities and values, disaster took a new form as man-made disasters. Wars, collisions, fires, accidents, train and aeroplane collisions, nuclear explosions, terrorist attacks. In fact, any act in which there was a human error at its source came to be known as man-made disaster, and this is what we are going to talk about today. Life and literature share a consanguineous tie. Life provides the raw material, literature dresses it up with an artistic form. The impact of the individual and collective impact of disasters on mankind have been the field of literature, and it is this disaster literature which has brought us on this common platform this evening. So disasters have been a fertile ground for meaningful discoveries, meaningful deliberations, and meaningful discourses as the one that we are having and the wonderful talk that just preceded this presentation. Death and disasters have been subjects of literature just as much as life and creation. And if we take a backward glance at human history, we'll find that it's sad, but it's true that disasters have always been a part of human destiny. Those twin towers standing tall with pride fell with grieving hearts, stunned America cried. We are still standing by Hannah's School Heart. The 9/11 attack cost the lives of 3,046 humans in a matter of a few hours. And 3,046 is not just a number. These were familiar faces of brothers, sisters, parents, colleagues, friends, all brought to an end within a matter of few hours. This unfathomable disaster made language seem inadequate. Language seemed to impede expression for a while just after the storm had passed. But it is ironical yet true that disaster leads to speechlessness and silence, yet disaster produces sublime literature. For the purpose of this brief talk, I shall confine myself only to the genre of poetry that was written after 9/11. Poetry that arises in direct response to a disaster becomes poetry of disaster, poetry of witness. Disaster neither symbolic nor metaphorical in these poems, but the basic content, the very sum and substance of the outpourings. The scarring memories of the dismal day were etched in poetry. I stare in total disbelief, heart torn with instant grief. Effluence of poetry all around, surge of poetry reading in the days that followed that. Not only poetry reading, but obviously poems were first composed and then read. Chronicling the despair and at times showing some light out of the tunnel, this new genre began to be referred to as 9/11 literature. Poems swept to pendulum extremes from futility of life to new lessons of hope. Obviously in those, even now, airplanes being the most availed means of transportation and also the most readily available, it was feared for some time that there may be a series of attacks. There was little to find hope, but yet there were poems that were providing some hope here and there. Remember to greet the sun each morning. Remember to enjoy every meal. Remember to value each person you meet. List of don't forgets and remembers. As C. Fox writes, poetry was suddenly everywhere in the city. New York was covered with poems. There were poems posted on lampposts. There were poems posted on airports, walls of subways, walls of bus stops. Downtown city people from New York even scrawled poetry on the ash that was found everywhere. Even on the photographs of the dead, there were lines of verse written. Poems.com alone published 25,000 poems in 6 months, and this number doubled by 2005. In times, this proliferation of poetry proved that in times of crisis, people gravitate more easily towards poetry. Poetry, which was not so visible in America, suddenly became almost indispensable. In 2014, author of Poetry of Disaster, Nicolai Coley, talks of 4 common elements of poetry of disaster. It relies on fragments born out of moments. It does not follow chronology and teleology. Poets write as images strike and not as the event took place. Invokes the collective. A poetry of disaster invokes the collective. There are thousands who have died, and these thousands are placed alongside the single subject of the poem. It asks ethical questions. It asks ethical questions about voice. Who is speaking and for whom? Can one write about a disaster without first-hand knowledge? It also challenges our knowledge of poetry as a genre. The poetry that we read, not only do we question the history of the moment, we also question poetry as a discourse and the use of language as representative of the world. So these 4 elements are all found abundantly in the poetry that we are discussing. Disaster turned to diversity, sweep of themes. Plumes of black smoke fill the air, marking a building no longer there. From poems that explored the bereavement of individuals, mourning the nation, lamenting its loss, poems expressed fear and revenge. Some poems expressed no outrage, but only they read almost as if we were reading prose, just an article, and in a blinding flash, America became a part of the scorched earth. Poetry was opening up new spaces. There was nothing, it felt as if there was nothing that a poet could not say. As Delilah in the novel Falling Man writes, people read poems. People I know, they read poetry to ease shock and pain, give them a kind of space, something beautiful, language to bring comfort or composure. The themes reiterated that disaster knows no difference. To it, the powerless and the powerful, the rich and the poor, the old and the young are all alike. Obviously, when there were so many poems, there was overlapping of themes due to proliferation, turning voices into platitudes. But undeterred by this, the poets kept writing. Martin Esparta's Albanza, which means in praise of, deserves a special mention. Now, this was a poem that he wrote for the 43 kitchen workers who were working at the windows of the Twin Towers right on the top floor, and they all perished while at work in the kitchen. So this poem ennobles the life of commoners and proves disaster as the democrat and democracy of the grave is highlighted. Lines from Polish Nobel Prize winner poet Borka says, they jumped from the burning floors, one to a few more, higher, lower, and I would like my esteemed audience to kindly pay a special attention to the last line. I can only do 2 things for them, describe the flight and not add a last line. The poem is left open-ended, perhaps as open as were the wounds, the bleeding, the lacerating wounds, both mental and physical, of the dead and the living dead. Economy of words, open-ended, from the pen of the poet right to the reader's heart. More than 10 different poetry anthologies came out after this 9/11 disaster, and 2 important ones that earned instant popularity were September 11, 2001, American Writers Respond, which was a miscellany of articles, essays, and poems, and one of the most important literary documents of the attacks, and the second was Poetry After 9/11, an anthology, New York Poets. All these revealed that poetry was entering forms less ritualistic and more appropriate to the expression of the moods and sympathies of a changing civilization. Now, this is one poem I'm sure most of us would be familiar with. This poem became an instantly very popular. This was by Toni Morrison, The Dead of September 11, and it represented almost all the traits that poetry was now changing into. To take up a few, it has a strong realism and preference for the concrete as against the abstract. Just 2 days after the attack, Toni Morrison composed To the Dead of September 11, which delineates all the changes that were to follow. It is subjective, introspective, yet strengthened by a biting realism. terse and colloquial diction, humane outlook. Now, these were the qualities and attributes of most of the poems that were gaining popularity. America's oneness is highlighted. She has used they and them, expressing regard for the supreme sacrifice of those who lost their lives, a poem of shared humanity. And as so many other poems, it is open to various interpretations. Mushrooming metricals, aggravating agony. Worldwide audience responded both in approval and disapproval of the new subgenre of poetry. Some believed the poems reignited the aura through that they had been through in the disaster. To some, the poems led to a sense of hopelessness. All that was dear to America, they said, now lay buried in the debris. Words are so small, words have no weight, and nothing will ever remain the same. Readers said, poems actually made them relive the trauma that they were trying to forget. It was alleged that 9/11 poems diluted the horror. The actual sharpness of the pain was made blunt by providing it with the halo of imagination. This was one of the charges against poetry. Zymos, a commentator, reportedly wrote, "Isn't 9/11 bad enough without adding poetry to it?" And Theodore Adorno, of course, long back, decades back, had written, "For these victims are used to create something, works of art, thrown to the consumption of a world which destroyed them. So the very perpetrators of the crime may be the ones who are now reading the poems." Thus, not all disaster poems were received as sources of solace. Some had a demoralizing effect, and America could least afford to be demoralized during those moments of crisis and could even lead the strongest to self-pity. So these were the negative charges. Moving on to the positive ones, finding a beginning in the end. Poets have always felt a moral imperative to bear witness in verse to disasters that have devastated humanity. Unconsciously, healing can begin when there is dialogue between the text in print and the reader or the listener. As Fried has very wisely said, not I, but the poet discovered the unconscious. Post 9/11, poems resonated a chord within that lessened pain. Philip Martin writes, and I quote, "It made some of us feel that we are not alone, that this terrible event came from terror and could lead to terror, and witness of poetry was more necessary than ever." When personal experiences are shared in words, it opens space for dialogue. We talked of bibliotherapy, and even the ISO principle, which is applicable to music, is also applied to poetry for the mood changes that it can bring about. By understanding the internal chaos while organizing thoughts on paper, the poet learns to adapt to the pain and gains better control over his or her emotions. And the same happens to his or her readers. Poet laureate Billy Collins' words can be taken to be the last word. Poetry is originally the grief counseling center. In reading poems on the disaster, the reader is assured that he, she is not a lone sufferer. So as he, she is trying to walk through his or her grief, the poems can actually act as an anchor, as a balm to the troubled mind. The cathartic influence promotes movement from the inside to the outside. So rather than coiling within, there is unburdening. And in conclusion, I would like to quote Ernest Hemingway, "Write hard and clear about what hurts." The 9/11 disaster poems will never date. They reveal the voices, experiences, and testimonies not available in mainstream representations of disasters. These poems will keep growing because year after year, anniversaries will be celebrated. America is, as it was covered with poems after 9/11, so also year after year on anniversaries, there are blogs, there are emails, and poetry is everywhere. Once again, telling us that in times of crisis, people turn to poetry. These poems will keep growing in number year after year. The wide thematic angle, because generation after generation, new perspectives are demanded, are expected. So there will be wide angles of exploration which will continue to awe us. Poems written post-2010 reveal a more welcoming and a more diverse New York after 9/11. These poems will continue to inspire and spread the message that the antidote to massacre and terrorism and death is not death and demolition, but compassion and healing. These disaster poems, resonating with strong sentiments, may help achieve closure and composure, defeating pain through pain will continue to speak volumes of the healing power of poetry, which is why I called my brief presentation Doomsday Defiance, Defeating Disaster Through Verity of Verse. To all of you who have given me a patient hearing, may this be my last word. Thank you very much. Thank you for being